The wind. It slammed like a hammer from the heavens. Sand whipped across the wide coastal plain, turning daylight into a crimson haze, swallowing everything in its path. Inside her isolated cottage, Clara, she stiffened at the sound of galloping hooves outside. Nobody ventured this far, not in a tempest like this. Her pulse, it jolted once, sharp, like it wanted to break free from her ribs. Through the swirl of grit, she glimpsed man, staggering off his horse. He looked frantic, half buried in sand, eyes wild with desperation. Before Clara could reach the door, he dropped to his knees. His voice, it broke through the gale. "Please, give me shelter from my girl." For a moment, Clara thought she'd misunderstood. Then she saw the cart behind him, barely holding against the wind's fury. Inside, a small face peered out, eyes wide with terror. A little girl. The man gestured weakly toward her before his strength gave out. Clara's heart raced. Her first instinct, it wasn't compassion. It was survival. No one in their right mind rode into a sandstorm like this. What if he was fleeing something worse? Her hand fumbled as she stepped back, nearly tripping over the stone threshold. She caught herself, darted inside, and grabbed the shotgun that hadn't been touched in months. The old Remington, it still smelled of oil and salt air. She chambered around, cracked the door just enough to shout into the wind. "Stay right there!" she called out. But the man, he didn't budge. He stayed kneeling, shoulders shaking, one hand still pointing toward the cart. The girl's cry, it sliced through the storm like a blade. Clara faltered. Her late husband used to say, "The coast tests your spirit before it claims your bones." She'd learned that lesson the hard way. Now, staring at the man and the frightened child, she faced another trial. Help them and risk everything. Shut the door and carry the sound of that girl's voice forever. Muttering a curse under her breath, Clara lowered the shotgun and ran into the storm. She pulled the little girl from the cart, wrapped her in her scarf, and dragged the man inside. The door slammed shut as the wind howled against the walls. The cottage groaned, but for the first time in years, Clara wasn't alone. The man gasped for breath, eyes glassy with exhaustion. Clara poured water into a dented mug, pressed it into his trembling hands. He whispered, voice fading, "My name's Caleb." Then, his head slumped forward, and he went still. Outside, the sandstorm roared on, clawing at the roof. Inside, silence and fear filled the space. Clara stared at the stranger sprawled on her floor, at the small child asleep beside him. What had she just let into her home? And worse, what if this man wasn't the one who needed saving? Morning came, heavy and quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in red sand and stillness. Clara stepped onto the porch, the air dry as driftwood, her boots crunching on grit. From the stable came a soft whinny, the only sign of life for miles. Behind her, Caleb stirred. He blinked slowly, disoriented, then sat up. His clothes were caked with dirt, his face pale beneath the sunburn. Clara poured water from a jug, handed him a mug. "You're lucky," she said. "Another hour out there and you'd be sand yourself." He nodded once, voice rough. "Guess I owe you more than I can repay." "Sophie's been coughing for days," Caleb said, his tone low, gravelly. "Heard there's a doctor 3 days west. Thought I could beat the storm. Guess I was wrong." He tried to stand, but fever hit him hard, so she made him rest through the day. By dawn, color returned to his face, though his voice still scratched when he spoke. The little girl, Sophie, she peeked from behind the curtain Clara had hung for privacy, clutching a carved wooden doll. Her eyes were wide, but curious. "Can I see the horses?" she asked. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Long as you stay where I can see you, outside." The sun blazed over the plain, and the fences were half buried, posts splintered loose. Caleb ran a hand along one post, testing the wood. "You built all this yourself?" "After my husband died. Clara said plainly. Guess I had to. Caleb didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, like he understood more than he let on. By noon, they worked together in a steady rhythm. He lifted, she braced. He hammered, she tied the wire. The air shimmered with heat and sand, but for the first time in years, Clara didn't mind the work. Caleb moved with quiet confidence, the kind of man who fixed things without making a fuss. Sophie trailed behind, humming a half-forgotten melody, her hair catching the sunlight. When they paused to drink, Clara caught herself watching Caleb. His hands, rough but gentle. His eyes, they stayed on the land, not her. Something about that steadiness, it settled her more than she expected. She tried to brush it off. No good comes from wanting what you can't keep. Later, as the sun sank low, they sat on the porch steps. The sky burned gold, the plain still and quiet. Clara handed Sophie a piece of bread and smiled when the girl thanked her with perfect manners. Caleb leaned back, tilting his hat down. Storm's gone. Guess that means we'll be moving on tomorrow. The words, they hit harder than she expected. Tomorrow. I hadn't realized how quickly I'd grown used to the sound of another voice in my home. She glanced at him, then at Sophie, crumbs on her cheek, smiling. The thought came unbidden. If they leave tomorrow, will this place ever feel alive again? Or will it just be walls and silence, waiting for the next storm? The next morning dawned bright and calm. The storm was gone, but its traces lingered. Sand on the porch, grit in her hair, the faint smell of salt and earth. Clara poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, handed one to Caleb. He nodded, thanks, sitting carefully on the porch rail, like he didn't want to take up too much space. Sophie chased a rooster across the yard, laughing so loud even the horse perked up. For the first time in years, that sound didn't make Clara flinch. It made her smile. You'll need to rest that horse another day. Trail that long, she won't make it far. Caleb looked at her, eyes the color of weathered iron. Guess I'll owe you one more night. Clara shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. Long as you pull your weight, you can owe me all you like. He grinned, and for a heartbeat, it felt easy. But easy, it never lasted long on the coast. Later, while hanging laundry, Clara spotted something in the cart. A fine leather saddle, too polished for a wanderer. Silver buckles etched with a mark she didn't know. The kind of thing wealthy landowners used, not men begging for refuge. When she asked about it, Caleb only said, "Old keepsake, hard to let go of good tools." He looked away, eyes fixed on the saddle. He said, "It was my father's. I failed him once. Bad enough that I still carry the weight. I keep it to remind myself I can do better for her." His gaze drifted to Sophie, asleep nearby. His voice, it carried something heavy, like regret he wasn't ready to name. That night, the air stayed warm. Crickets chirped outside, and the horizon glowed faintly with distant lightning. Clara sat by the open door, mending a torn jacket sleeve. Caleb worked nearby, fixing the handle of her old rake. They didn't talk much, but the silence felt less empty than before. At one point, Sophie ran in, a handful of sea lavender in her hands. She set them in a glass jar. "For you, Miss Clara," she said proudly. Clara's throat tightened. No one had called her Miss anything in years. She smiled, patted the girl's hair. "Thank you, sweetheart." When Sophie went to bed, Clara caught Caleb watching her from across the table. He looked away fast, like he'd been caught thinking too much. She tried to laugh it off. "Don't look at me like that. I'm not the saving type." He gave a slow smile. "Maybe I am." Something shifted in the air then. Not loud, not sudden, just a sense that the world was tilting towards something new. Clara didn't know it yet, but this quiet night, it was about to change her life forever. Days turned into weeks, slipping by quietly between chores and sunsets. By the time Caleb spoke of heading home, the thought of him leaving felt like losing the only peace she'd known in years. One night, when the air was still and the stars hung low, Clara spoke of her husband's death for the first time. Caleb listened, steady and quiet, then shared how he'd lost his wife 2 winters ago. For a long while, they said nothing. Sometimes silence, it's the only way 2 wounded hearts can understand each other. All right, if you're still with me, take a sip of that coffee or tea. Tell me, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from? And hey, if you want to hear what happens next, hit that subscribe button. It means everything when you stick around for the next chapter. The next few days, they passed faster than Clara expected. The sun was bright, the land dry again, and Caleb's strength had returned. He fixed the cart's wheel, polished the saddle, packed their few belongings without a word. Clara watched from the porch, arms crossed, trying not to feel the ache. But when Sophie ran up to hug her, that quiet resolve cracked. "Papa says we have to go home," she said softly. "Will you come visit us?" Clara didn't know how to answer. Home. It had been so long since that word meant anything. Caleb turned to her then, hat in hand. He said, "There's a town west of here. Doctor there needs to check Sophie's cough. After that, I'd like to show you where we live." Clara almost laughed. "You sure your folks want a stranger showing up unannounced?" He gave a slow smile. "Pretty sure they'll manage." The road west was rough, but the world felt wider now. The air smelled of salt and sage, and every mile stirred Clara's curiosity. When the cart crested the final hill, her breath caught. Below stretched a vast plain, dotted with white fences and grazing herds, the largest ranch she'd ever seen. Caleb pulled the reins and said quietly, "Welcome to the Harrow Ranch." She turned to him, stunned. "You are a rancher." Her eyes caught a row of saddles in the barn, each stamped with the same silver mark as the one in his cart. Suddenly, that fine leather saddle made sense. Caleb hadn't been running from something, he'd been running home. "Something like that," he said, his tone hinting at more he wasn't ready to share. At the gate, a tall man with a weathered beard tipped his hat. "Good to see you, boss," he said. Boss, the word, it hit Clara harder than the storm ever could. Inside, people stared, hands paused, whispers drifted like dust in the wind. "That's her, the woman from the storm. She's just after his land." Clara acted like she didn't hear, but every word stung. She kept busy in the kitchen, scrubbing pots, feeding hens, anything to prove she wasn't here for handouts. Sophie followed her everywhere, bright and fearless, holding her hand in front of everyone. That helped, more than anyone knew. At supper, the foreman, Amos, he sat across the table studying Clara with keen eyes. When she met his gaze, he nodded once. "Good work with those pots. The cook's been grumbling for weeks." It wasn't much, but it was the first kindness she'd felt all day. Over the next weeks, Clara kept her head down, her hands busy. When a fence broke, she was there with wire and hammer before anyone asked. One afternoon, a calf slipped into the marsh, stuck deep in the mud. Before anyone moved, Clara was there, boots sinking, rope in hand. When the calf was free, an older ranch hand who had never spoken to her nodded once. "Good work, ma'am." After that, the whispers faded. By the time the season turned, even Amos was tipping his hat when she passed. That night, when the house was quiet, Clara stood outside, staring at the stars. She'd survived storms before, but this was a different kind, made of whispers and judgment instead of wind and sand. She couldn't help wondering, had she stepped into a place that would break her heart again? Or was this where her story was meant to begin? The days that followed, they were quieter but not easier. Clara worked from dawn to dusk, side by side with the ranch hands, mending fences, feeding calves, learning the rhythm of ranch life. It felt good to work for something real again. Still, the whispers lingered. Some said she didn't belong, others said Caleb had lost his senses bringing home a woman he barely knew. But every time Clara thought of leaving, Sophie's laughter pulled her back. The girl would run across the yard calling her name, and for a moment, the noise of judgment faded. One evening, the The sky glowed amber over the pastures. Clara was stacking hay bales when Caleb approached, hat in hand. "You've been working harder than half my crew," he said. "Seems to me you've earned more than a thank you." She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm not looking for anything, Caleb." He stepped closer, eyes steady. "Maybe not, but you deserve everything good that comes your way." The wind shifted, warm and soft, carrying the scent of grass and salt. He hesitated before speaking again. "Folks talk. Let 'em. I know who you are." Clara shook her head. "People like me, we don't get happy endings." Caleb reached for her hand, his rough palm against her calloused fingers. Maybe it's time that changed. The wedding was small, just the ranch crew and the preacher who'd known Caleb's family for years. Sophie wore a white dress, tossing sea lavender into the air. When Caleb said his vows, his voice didn't waver. He said, "I thought the storm was meant to bury me. Turns out it carried me right to where I was supposed to be." After the ceremony, Clara stood on the porch of her new home, watching the land glow under the setting sun. She thought about all she'd lost and all she'd found by opening that door. Sometimes she realized, love doesn't arrive with flowers and promises. Sometimes it shows up covered in sand, asking for a place to stay. She smiled, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. The storm had brought her a family, a purpose, and a reason to believe again. Maybe that's the lesson this land keeps teaching. No matter how fierce the wind gets, there's always a chance to rebuild. You just have to open the door. Now, tell me something. Have you ever met someone who changed your life when you least expected it? If you have, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this tale warmed your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the soul of the wild. All right, take another sip of that coffee or tea. What time is it where you are, and where are you listening from? Let me know. And if you're ready for more, hit subscribe to catch the next chapter.